In every movement, there comes a moment when the question really needs to be asked. See, who will guard what has been given? See, after Jesus' resurrection and his ascension, a small group of disciples remained in Jerusalem. They were not there to create a new religion, but to keep living the way he had taught them to live. And at the center of that community stood a man whom the early believers would simply call James the Just. Now this man, James, he was the steward of Jesus' teachings. In a previous video, there was some evidence of the teachings of James. We provided that. And we will refer back to this video at the end of this presentation. See, however, in this video, in addition to his teachings, we will also focus on the person of James himself. He was not a fisherman, and after the death of his brother, James became the shepherd of the movement that his brother Jesus had left behind. And our earliest sources agree that James was the brother of Jesus, not merely a follower or an admirer. No. Paul, in fact, mentions him directly. Galatians 1 and verse 19. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. Hegesippus, a 2nd century Jewish follower of Jesus, he describes James as a Nazarite-like figure. No wine, no meat, no oil, linen garments, knees calloused from prayer. He was seen as a righteous man even by those who rejected Jesus the Messiah. Hence his name, James the Just. And this is really important. James was not some theological invention. No. He was a well-known figure. Where? In Jerusalem. He was respected, austere, yes, devout, certainly, and credible to the Jewish world. And this was the ancient Jewish Christian view from ones like, Hegesippus, Clement of Alexandria, Jerome, Epiphanius. And their view? James the Just was the same as James the son of Alphaeus. Jude, Thaddeus, was the brother of James. Simon the Zealot was the brother, or perhaps even the cousin, of the same household. Now, if that view is correct, then the gospel list already included the Lord's family, Jesus' family, of course under alternate identifications. And what is more is that this solves several historical puzzles. Firstly, it explains their authority in Jerusalem, these three individuals. It explains their missionary activity. It explains why Paul calls James an apostle. It explains 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5, brothers of the Lord doing apostolic work. It also explains early Eastern traditions of Simon and Jude, where? In Persia. And it explains the density of kinship inside those 12. See, this was something common in Jewish movements. And the book of Acts, it makes acknowledgement of a subtle but decisive point. Excuse me. By Acts chapter 12, it is James, not Peter, who presides over the assembly. Check this out from a link from the Vatican website. Interesting link. This is a homily by the then Pope, 2012, I think it was. Right. And when you read it, and do this at the end of this video, when you read it, look out for how James is highlighted as the head of the early church. Look out for that. And you'll have to look, because you won't find it. Not even a mention of James in this Pope's homily. Yet, according to his own inspired Bible canon, what do we find? Well, at Acts chapter 12 and verse 17, Peter acknowledges a certain reality which clearly this Pope didn't. Peter has just escaped from Herod's custody. He leaves Jerusalem, but he instructs the believers, tell these things to James and to the brothers. And by Acts chapter 15, at that famous council, James gives the final ruling. See, Peter speaks. Paul and Barnabas, well, they testify. But James decides. Now, this is a detail that is often not fully appreciated. And also notice that this first ruling of this church, the early congregation, it was not doctrinal. It was pastoral. Yeah. It was not about defining some abstract theology. No. It was about protecting the fellowship between Jews and Gentiles without violating anyone's conscience. This tells us something about James's leadership, doesn't it? You see, he guarded unity, but without sacrificing righteousness. He avoided conflict, but without bowing to Rome or the temple elite. He prioritized obedience rather than just speculation. Obedience. Because in a world full of power, what did James do? He practiced stewardship, leadership. So what was the teachings of James? And here we come to the core, really, of this presentation. See, James is the only New Testament voice, I repeat, James is the only New Testament voice who gives us a sermon that sounds like Jesus himself. See, this epistle of James is not something metaphysical. No, nothing of the kind. It does not explain the mechanism of the cross or the stake. It does not systematize salvation. You do this in order to. It does not speculate on Christ's nature. Instead, James asks a very simple question. What kind of person is God shaping you to become? His concerns, really, they echo that of Jesus himself, don't they? See, James speaks the same language that Jesus spoke. When he spoke about the commandments, mercy, justice, poverty, meekness, endurance, obedience, the religion of James is not sacrificial in any way. It is ethical in everything. And this is how he defines, James, how he defines pure religion. Now compare this with what Jesus taught in his Sermon on the Mount. Excuse me. Found in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. Now, this is the way James defines pure religion. James chapter 1 and verse 27. Pure and undefiled religion from our God, right, before our God rather, and Father, is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Excuse me. So let's examine, some points really between the letter of James and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in the form of sort of category comparisons, if you like. And there are probably some 15 in all. Now, we don't have time to quote every scripture comparison, but we will list them for you for your private study. However, we will quote a few really to get a flavor. And that's important, isn't it? See, what about joy and perseverance under trial? James 1 and verses 2 and 3. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you encounter trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Now, you compare that with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount at Matthew 5 and 11 and 12. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets before you. Another category, perfection and maturity. James chapter 1 and verse 4. Compare it with Matthew 5 and verse 48. How about asking and receiving from God? James chapter 1 and verse 5. Compare it with Matthew chapter 7 and verse 7. And here's a good one. Hearing versus doing the word. So let's read James 1 and verse 22. Be doers of the word and not hearers only. Otherwise, you are deceiving yourselves. Now, compare this with Matthew chapter 7 and verse 24. This is the way Jesus put it. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. How do we regard the poor in the kingdom? Well, let's read James chapter 2 and verse 5. Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? How did Jesus put it? Matthew 5 and verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What about keeping the whole law? Well, you can go to James 2 and verse 10 and compare it with Matthew 5 and verse 19. See, then we have mercy and judgment. Okay, go to James chapter 2 and verse 13 and compare it with Matthew 5 and verse 7. How about faith and works? James chapter 2 and verse 4. Now we'll read this. Have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? How did Jesus put it? Matthew 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. How about our fruitage? Our true character. James 3 and verse 12. Let's read that. My brothers, can a fig tree grow olives? Or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Jesus puts it this way. By their fruits you will recognize them. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Our 10th point, peacemaking and righteousness. James 3:18, well, compare that with Matthew chapter 5 and verse 9. And again on the 11th point, friendship with the world. Well, we have covered that a few times, haven't we? James 4 and verse 4. But compare it with Matthew 6 and verse 24. What about purity of our hearts? James 4 and verse 8. We'll read that. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Now compare this with how Jesus put it at Matthew 5 and verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Judging others? Well, James 4:12. Compare it with Matthew 7 and verse 1. How about earthly treasures? James 5, 2 and 3, again compare it with how Jesus put it at Matthew 6 and verse 19. And then finally, the 15th point, oaths and speech. James 5:12, compare it with Matthew 5:33 to 37. Now, these alignments show how James applies Jesus' ethical teachings to a practical Christian living. See, this is Judaism in its prophetic form. See, it's not a liturgy. It's not a ritual. It's not as a belief. This is the same form that Jesus himself he stood within. Now, by the mid-century of that first century, the temple leadership viewed the Jesus movement led by this man James. They viewed them as a real threat. Why? Well, it was not because of sacrifices, but because of righteousness. See, the Jewish historian Josephus, he records this, that James was executed by the high priest Annas, Ben Annas, around 62 CE, without Roman authorization. So this is something the Jews did themselves. He took advantage of a gap, really, in the Roman governance. And we can deal with that at another time. It was highly illegal, but nevertheless, they did it. The Jewish disciple and historian Hegesippus, well, he adds that James was thrown from the temple pinnacle and beaten to death with clubs. By who? Likely by priests. Now, this tells us three things. By 62 CE, the Jesus movement was still centered in Jerusalem. Its leader was not killed by Rome, but by the temple elite. The threat posed by James was a moral one, a communal one, not a violent one. It was in the prophetic pattern, really, of ones like Jeremiah and Zechariah, prophets before. See, James, he died at the very hands of the institution he sought to purify. However, James preserved three crucial elements of the Jesus movement, if you like. See, the first one, the commandments of Jesus as actual commandments, not symbols, not metaphors, not theologized sort of abstractions, no, commands. The community of the poor, really a fellowship that made the kingdom visible through economics, not institutions. It was practical help. Non-sacrificial righteousness, mercy instead of offerings, obedience instead of ritual. You see, when James died, well, these three pillars lost their anchor. James is often missing from the story of Christian origins. Pope Benedict's homily we have referred to earlier is clearly testament to this. Go and read it. It's very interesting. Yet, without him, James, there is no bridge from Jesus to the movement that followed. Because James, he taught no doctrine of substitution. He offered no speculative Christology, as we've come to describe it. He built no metaphysical system. He simply guarded what had been given him by his brother. And his life raises the question that echoes across the centuries, right down to us. And please keep this point in mind. See that if we draw the same comparisons But with the Shem Tov Gospel of Matthew, not the Greek one, the Shem Tov Gospel, we will find that these alignments would be even tighter. Now, we did cover a lot of this material in a previous video, Series 6, on the 18th of December 25, entitled The Two Jesuses in Matthew, that's James and Shem Tov. Now, I'll provide a link, in the credits for that. So you can go back and just sort of have a look at that again. This leads us to really one final observation. The timing of this letter. Now, taking account of all the internal evidence we have covered so far, what is lacking? Well, there's no evidence of any awareness of the temple's destruction. So that would date it sometime prior to 70 CE. There is also no evidence of any awareness of Paul's writings or conflicts with him. There's no evidence of any awareness of the First Jerusalem Council, which he presided over. So that would date it to probably the mid-40s CE, or perhaps even earlier. Now, as far as the quality of the Greek, which this letter is written in, is concerned, well, James's temple connections, and we've covered this, makes it highly likely that he had access to an amanuensis or other scribal help. Remember what an amanuensis was? Paul's Tertius, Rome, 1622. Okay. Now, all of this takes me in the direction that this would make the letter of James the earliest New Testament writing. And if Christianity had kept to James' stewardship, all they had to do was keep to it, what kind of faith would we have inherited today? That's a closing point we would do well to reflect on. So, next we will turn to another figure. This one who stood between the prophetic world of Judea and the political reality of Rome. And who would that be? It was Simon Peter. But that's for next week. So once again, thank you and see you again.